Hello and welcome to our video. On this video, we're going to be changing the lower ball joints and outer tie rod ends on our 2002 Lexus GS 300. Now, if you look in the service manual, the owner's manual, it's going to show you the central jacking point, and we have it jacked up at that point. And we also put 2 jack stands under the car, and we put wheel chocks under the rear wheels. E-brake is all the way on. Transmissions in park so that nothing can happen, nothing can slip. And as we're doing this work, we'll also put 1 tire under the front of the car in case it was to fall, just as a safety factor. So we have all of our genuine Toyota parts that we got from the Lexus Dealer. We recommend you only use genuine Toyota parts. You can get other parts cheaper. But the reason we're doing this job is some of the parts were replaced recently, and they're already bad because they're made in China and no good. So we'll show you more about that as we get into the video. So now you know the jacking point, using genuine Toyota parts. Always wear safety glasses. And I'm going to show you some of the tools we're going to be using here in just a second. In doing this job, you may need to use an impact driver, and we have a Cobalt one here that's electric, works really great. Also, you're going to need various kinds of arm pullers, like Pitman arm pullers, this type of puller here, this type of puller. We don't know which ones we're going to need for this particular application, because some of these we use on our trucks, some of them we use on our cars, and we figure out which one's the best fit for the application. So we'll figure that out once we get into the vehicle. So what we're doing now is we're going to take one of the front wheels off, and I'm going to show you that. Using a breaker bar and a special socket like this so it won't damage the lug nuts, you want to take all of your lug nuts out, which I'm going to do. Left to loosen. You don't want to use a torque wrench to loosen your lug nuts, but you want to use a torque wrench to put them back on. So I'm going to take all of these lug nuts off very carefully, set them aside. And this is also a really great time to inspect your brake pads. These were done in the recent past, but I'm going to check it since it was done by the dealer. And I don't have a lot of trust for the dealer mechanics. As a matter of fact, I recently heard of brake pads being put on incorrectly, the inside going to the outside, outside going to the inside, and it caused some damage on a car, and a dealer did that. And I was like, wow, that's pretty bad. I don't see how you could do that. Anyway, so we're going to inspect the brakes, and we're going to inspect all of the upper suspension components and possibly put some lubricant on those, some rubber type lubricant so they stay good and soft and pliable. So wheel comes off now. And then I'm going to put it underneath the vehicle. So if the vehicle was to fall while I'm working on it, well, I've got multiple safety zones. I have the central jacking point. I have jack stands on each side, wheel chocks in the back, the wheel under here. If it was to fall, I'm not going to get my hands pinched off, or I have all my fingers. Been working on cars for 50 years. So now I feel very safe, and I can go ahead and start the work. And I'm going to get started here in just a second. This is the outer tie rod end, and we're on the driver's side of the car right now. You have to pull the cotter pin out. In this case, they used a kind of a funky cotter pin. I was able just to pop it right out. So that's going to come out, and then that castle nut, we have to loosen it. But before I loosen it, I'm going to take the cotter pin out of the lower ball joint, which is down at the very bottom. If you go directly underneath the disc brake, and I'll show you a picture of that here in a second. So this is the castle nut on the lower ball joint. It's pointing down to the ground. And what I got to do is take this cotter pin out. This one's coming out pretty easy because somebody had worked on it recently and changed these parts, like I said, with some of them were changed with inferior parts. Now, how do we know that? Well, if you feel around, you can see all the grease coming out of the ball joint. I don't know if you can see it on my glove there or not, but that and the other tie rod end, they're leaking like crazy. Junk parts, please don't do that. This job takes long enough as it is, so why waste money by putting in cheap parts and not using the original ones? So I'm going to get these nuts loose, and then we'll show you how we're going to work next. Going back to the outer tie rod end, after I took the cotter pin out, I used a 17 millimeter wrench, and I tapped on it with a soft blow hammer, and I'm able to get that nut loose. So that's loose now. And then I went underneath to the ball joint and I started that nut coming loose with a 19 millimeter socket, and it's torqued on pretty strongly, so you have to use a good sized cheater bar. So I'll get that one loosened up, and then I'm going to start taking some other bolts out as we go along, and so I'll show you that. Before you take the outer tie rod loose, go ahead and loosen this castle nut using a 19 millimeter socket impact type. And then there's two 17 millimeters that hold the ball joint to the components here. So we've gone ahead and loosened them now so that we can take the outer tie rod loose, drop it down, and then be able to start manipulating getting out the lower ball joint. And we'll come back to that in a minute. So let me get all my tools set up and then I'll show you that part. Okay, something I forgot to show a while ago is you're going to need to take this nut loose on the outer tie rod. So to do that, we use this setup, we use this all the time. We take a simple floor jack, a scissor jack, and we put like a wrench here to hold the outer tie rod. There's a couple of indentions on it where you can put a wrench. And in this case, 19 millimeter metric wrench. And we loosen the nut without disturbing any of the geometries here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take a paint marker. Also, I clean the threads in here. So I'm going to take a paint marker and thoroughly paint in here such that when we take the outer tie rod loose and off, I'll have a reference point and I can get it back. Probably it won't even need alignment if I can get it exactly to the right thread. So I'm going to get that all painted up and let that dry while I'm working. And then we can take that component loose, like I say, without losing its relative position. As long as you get the threads marked all the way to the edge. And again, I cleaned them with alcohol first. So get that all done. Now I'm going to go ahead and get a tool and we're going to take this outer tie rod loose from here, and I'll show you that. Okay, I'm ready to pull this outer tie rod end, and I'm using this tool called a gear wrench 3916D, of course available on Amazon. And you put it on there and you turn this, and eventually it should pop loose all of a sudden. Might seem a little scary when it does. And this is what it's doing, is pressing out that press fitting. So, should pop out any second now. And there it goes. Woohoo! Scared me. All right, so now this is loose, and now you can see all the grease that was leaking out of it. Can you see that on the camera? Just totally leaking grease. This is an aftermarket piece of crap part. So, good reason not to use those. So now, with that having been said, we're going to start working on the lower ball joint. So it's basically this whole assembly here. And let me go get the actual parts that we're going to be putting in so I can show you what they look like and you can get an idea of how they go in. So I wanted to take a minute out to show you the outer tie rod, new versus old. So the new one comes with a castle nut and a cotter pin. You always want to use those. The new one is very stiff. You can't move it. The boot is complete. The old one, the boot is ripped, it's leaking, and also this is very loose. So a lot of times these rebuild manufacturers, what they do is they take an original casting and they build it up, put a new ball in after they've machined it out, but it just doesn't hold up very well. It's good for maybe 10 or 15,000 miles, just enough to get you down the road. Whereas these should realistically last 100,000 miles, in my opinion. And then, so I'm going to set that aside and we're going to start removing the lower ball joint. Before I pull the lower ball joint, I want to show you what a new one looks like. So here's a brand new one. This part here, the ball area, is very stiff. There's no movement or play in it, no leakage. Obviously, this is all intact. It comes with, again, a new castle nut and cotter pin. And then also, you always want to replace the 2 bolts. So we got 4 bolts. They come from Toyota with Loctite already applied. And so you want to replace these with new bolts, the ones that go in here, and I'll show you that at a different angle in a second. Because this is a very important steering component. If it has any damage, collapses, comes apart, anything like that, your steering can, your wheel can collapse into the car. It happens somewhat frequently on cars. You'll see them on the freeway with their wheels jammed up into the wheel well, and that's usually a lower ball joint problem. So with that having been said, I'm going to come and show you where all these bolts are located underneath. This actually sits like this underneath, and we're going to take out these 2 bolts, take off the castle nut, and use the puller to pull the whole thing loose. Here's the lower ball joint, and the castle nut, I've got it loose, so I'm just going to take it off. And then the 2 bolts that secure the ball joint are here. I'll take it out. And then there's one back behind. I'll take it out. And while I'm taking that one out, I wanted to show you what a lousy mechanic does. I don't know if you can see this hit mark here on the ball joint, but that's because somebody hit it to get this pressed in fitting loose. And that's a real, in my opinion, not a good thing to do. Because what they're doing is they're hitting it and trying to make the piece come out at the same time rather than just using the proper tool. Also, you can see the dust shield here has been hammered back and bent up because, well, that's what a lot of mechanics do when you're in the waiting room waiting for them and they're getting your car ready and they just do crap work. Also, you'll notice all this grease just dripping out. It's horrible. So I'm going to put my tool on here and then I'm going to show you how we're going to pull this out. Okay, I'm temporarily putting one of the bolts back in and I flip the castle nut over backwards so that I can put this tool on here, get it to slide in there hopefully, and then I can break this loose. So let me see if this tool is going to work, or I may have to use a different one. I'm not sure yet. So I'll show you here in a second. This one wouldn't work in this application, so we got out our good old W142 performance tool puller, and I put it on there now. And so it's ready for me to start tightening. And this is going to pop pretty loudly when it comes loose. That's why I put the bolt back in, so that when it does pop loose, it just won't flop down. So it's going to take me a while here. There we go. Kaboom! That's how easy it is when you have the right tools, though. Isn't that nice? So I'll take the tool off, set it aside, and then we will start to pull this off. This is the lower ball joint. I wanted to show you how I pulled it out, but it's a 2-person job. So we had to have one person come over here, and they have gloves on so they can't get injured. And they lifted this whole assembly up while I took this assembly out. It's on the other side of this brake area. So I just simply pulled it up and pulled it out, and we're going to throw it away. So I'm going to try to do a little better pictures of showing you how to install the new one, but I got to get it all cleaned up. It's a greasy mess underneath there, and I'll get all that done, and then I'm going to show you how we're going to put the new one in. Okay, I cleaned up the area where the old ball joint went in, and the new one's going to go in something like that. And then this whole piece goes on here, and there's some bushings that have to fit exactly into it, but that's a 2-person job. So we're going to get it all lined up, and I'm going to get the bolts started, and then I'm going to show you what we're going to do on the next part of it. Okay, I've put new lower ball joint bolts in and just hand tightened them. Then I put the castle nut on, and that gets tightened to 119 foot-pounds of torque. So I'm working on that right now, and we're going to get that torqued up, and then we'll put its cotter pin in. There we go, 119. So Now I'll need to make sure that there's an opening, a hole to put the cotter pin in. If not, I may have to tighten it slightly tighter. That's okay. I'll put that in, and then we're going to come and torque in these other bolts. So I'll get that done here in a second. With the castle nut torqued down to 119, we actually had to back off just slightly to get the cotter pin in. The cotter pin's in and set. Now these two bolts have to be torqued in at 83 foot-pounds. In order to do that, I have to turn the whole assembly this way so that it comes to its stop. And so I'll put the torque wrench on, torque them to 83 foot-pounds, and then we'll be ready to put on the outer tie rod. I put the outer tie rod on, the new one, and I've threaded it on all the way to the very edge of where my yellow marker came. So I'm certainly not more than one thread off, but I'm pretty sure I'm exactly right on where it was. So this should keep us relatively in good alignment. You should always get your car aligned after you've done any front end work. And now I'm going to put the castle nut over here and tighten it up to, I think it's 63 foot-pounds. I'll check. And then I'll come back and we will put the cotter pin in. And then I'll show you how we're going to tighten this up so it stays in relative alignment. We have the castle nut tightened up to 64 foot-pounds. Now your torque wrench isn't going to reach in there. So what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to use a crow's foot wrench. And you have to run it at the same angle as with the torque wrench so that you have the same torque here as on the torque wrench. And that's going to get you to 64 foot-pounds. And then you put the cotter pin in. And next what we're going to do is tighten up the outer tie rod here. And I'll show you that here in just a second. Okay, I'm ready to tighten up this nut that goes on the outer tie rod. I couldn't find a torque spec on it. I'm going to say probably at least 35 or 40 foot-pounds of torque should be adequate. I have paint underneath it, so it's going to kind of freeze it into place. So you put your crescent wrench on the outer tie rod itself. There's a couple of indents on it. And then you're going to take your wrench and tighten it up. And I'm going to do it by hand. And so I'm going to do it to my best guess of around 40 or so foot-pounds of torque. Okay, so I've got that torqued up. And then I'm going to do a couple things in here to clean it up. And I'll show you that here in a moment. So now that we've finished putting everything back together, what we did is we gave a final spray down of some Armor All to all the bushings on everything in here, including the bush bearing for the shock tower, or struts. We put Armor All on all that, all the lower suspension pieces, all the bushings anywhere where there's a rubber bushing. We went ahead and sprayed it because we live in the desert Southwest where these bushings tend to dry out is what they tend to do. So got all that done. Now we're finished. We're going to put the wheel back on, torque it to the right torque spec, and that's all there is to this video. Thank you for watching.